Welcome to Teach My Kids Storytime. I'm Sunita and today I'm going to read to you the story The Lighthouse Keeper's Lunch, written by Ronda and David Armitage. Every day, Mr Grinling, the lighthouse keeper, tucks into a delicious lunch prepared by his wife. But Mr Grinling isn't the only one who enjoys the tasty food. Will Mrs Grinling think of a way to stop the greedy seagulls from stealing the lighthouse keeper's lunch? What do you think Mrs Grinling will do? Have a guess before we read the story. I hope you enjoy listening to the story and remember to like and subscribe below. Once there was a lighthouse keeper called Mr Grinling. At night time he lived in a small white cottage perched high on the cliffs. In the daytime he rowed out to his lighthouse on the rocks to clean and polish the light. Can you spot Mr Grinling's cottage in the cliffs? There it is. And here we can see Mr Grinling's lighthouse. Mr Grinling was a most industrious lighthouse keeper. Come rain or shine, he tended his light. What do you think the word industrious means? Sometimes at night, Mr Grinling lay sleeping in his warm bed. The ships would toot to tell him that his light was shining brightly and clearly out to sea. Can see the beam of light coming out of the lighthouse there, helping the ships find their way. Each morning, while Mr Grinling polished the light, Mrs Grinling worked in the kitchen of the little white cottage on the hills, concocting a delicious lunch for him. Let's have a look at Mrs Grinling's ingredients. What do you think she's going to prepare for him today? Once she had prepared the lunch, she packed it into a special basket and clipped it onto a wire that ran from the little white cottage to the lighthouse on the rocks. But one Monday something terrible happened. Mrs Grinling had prepared a particularly appetizing lunch. She had made a mixed seafood salad, a lighthouse sandwich, cold chicken, sausages and crisps, peach surprise, iced sea biscuits, drinks and assorted fruit. She put the lunch in the basket and, as usual, and sent it down the wire. But the lunch did not arrive. It was spotted by 3 scavenging seagulls who set upon it and devoured it with great gusto. "Clear off, you varmints!" shouted Mr Grinling. But the seagulls took not the slightest notice. Here are the 3 seagulls. 1, 2, 3. "This is an excellent peach surprise, boys." "Ooh, she's a great cook, Fred." "Scrumptious lunch, Tom." And look at Mr Grinling. Look at his face, not a happy man. That evening, Mr and Mrs Grinling decided on a plan to baffle the seagulls. "Tomorrow I shall tie the napkin to the basket," said Mrs Grinling. "Of course, my dear," agreed Mr Grinling. "A sound plan." And here we've got the basket, but look what's happened. "They'll have to try harder than this to stop us, Bert." On Tuesday evening, Mr and Mrs Grinling racked their brains for another plan. Can you guess what their plan might be this time? Have a look at the picture. See what you think. "They are a brazen lot, those seagulls," said Mrs Grinling. "Brazen indeed," said Mr Grinling. "What shall we do?" "Our cat does not appear to like the seagulls," said Mrs Grinling. "No, my dear," said Mr Grinling. "Hamish is an accomplished seagull chaser." "Of course," exclaimed Mrs Grinling. "Tomorrow Hamish can guard the lunch." "A most ingenious plan," agreed Mr Grinling. Hamish did not think that this plan was ingenious at all. He spat and he hissed as Mrs Grinling secured him in the basket. There, Hamish," said Mrs Grinling consolingly. "I'll have a tasty piece of herring waiting for you when you arrive home." Sadly, Flying did not agree with Hamish. His fur stood on end when the basket swayed. His whisker drooped when he peered down at the wet blue sea, and he felt much too sick to even notice the seagulls, let alone scare them away from the lunch. An unhappy Hamish and some happy seagulls. "Pretty kitty, like a piece of lobster mornay?" "This food gets better every day, Fred." "Aren't you going to chase us, Kitty?" "Lackaday, lackaday," said Mr Grinling sadly. "Meow, meow," agreed Hamish pitifully. On Wednesday evening, Mr and Mrs Grinling racked their brains again for a new plan. "What shall we do?" said Mr Grinling. Mrs Grinling looked thoughtfully. "I have it," she exclaimed. "Just the mixture for hungry seagulls." What do you think their plan might be this time? Do you think Hamish is going to be part of the plan again? "Indeed, my dear," said Mr Grinling. "What have you in mind?" "Wait and see," said Mrs Grinling. "Just wait and see." "Mustard sandwiches," chuckled Mr Grinling. "A truly superb plan, my dear, truly superb." On Thursday morning, Mrs Grinling carefully packed the mustard sandwiches and sent them off down the wire to the expectant seagulls. "Yuck! Ugh! Ugh!" On Friday, Mrs Grinling repeated the mustard mixture. All right, boys, let's go and have lunch elsewhere. It's the same as yesterday's lunch, Fred. Some very disappointed seagulls. So, on Saturday, up in the little white cottage on the cliffs, a jubilant Mrs Grinling put away the mustard pot before she prepared a scrumptious lunch for Mr Grinling. Jubilant. What do you think the word jubilant means? Have a look at Mrs Grinling. That might give you a clue. While he waited for his lunch down in the lighthouse on the rocks, Mr Grinling sang snatches of old sea shanties as he surveyed the coastline through his telescope. And this is what he saw. No mustard in this lot, Tom. We'll fly back here again for lunch tomorrow, boys. This is a delicious chocolate eclair, Fred. Ah, well, such is life, mused Mr Grinling, as he sat down to enjoy a leisurely lunch in the warm sunshine. That was the story of The Lighthouse Keeper's Lunch. Lucky Mrs Grinling was able to think of a way of keeping the seagulls away. What would your favourite lunch be? Have a look in the description below where I've left a link where you can download a worksheet to draw or write what your favourite lunch is. And if you enjoyed this story, here are some more books all about the Lighthouse Keeper's adventures. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, like and subscribe below. See you again soon.